The situation seems to be pretty bleak in New York for low-income to moderately middle-income people to find affordable housing. And that's true in your district as it is in many others. How do you see that battle for being able to give people of those descriptions, lower income and moderately middle-income people, a real shot at a decent place to live that they can afford?
We have to change the laws. The laws were weakened back in 1996. That led to a lot of deregulation of apartments that were no longer subject to rent regulations. There's a lot of speculation. I mean, when I was a tenant organizer, housing was only a problem for poor people in the outer boroughs. It is now a problem for everyone, irrespective of income levels, irrespective of where you live.
Except for the rich.
Well, the very rich.
It's not a problem
for the very
rich.
rich.
Yeah.
So, and I think this city needs to make a commitment, 80-20, where you do 80% affordable, 80% luxury housing with 20% affordable housing, has been the standard in this city for over 20 years.
You think that's adequate?
No, that needs to be changed. And I fought for that early on, where they were extending tax abatements to developers. And I said, well, if we're going to do that, tax abatements, what they call the 421A tax legislation, was enacted during the fiscal crisis of the 70s because no one was developing in New York City, so that was to encourage development. Yeah. When I got into the city council in 2006, I said, you don't need to encourage development. I mean, 80% of the phone calls I was getting was noise complaints about construction in my office. So I said, I don't think there's a need for this, but if we're going to do this, then we need to change the model, and it can't be 80-20. What they did was to make it 80-20 within one building, because you could do 80-20, 20% off-site somewhere else, which is how all the housing got built in the Bronx. So they decided to make it in the same building. But they didn't change the numbers of the number of units that needed to be made. And the funding for that 20% is such that you have some people who make too little money and can't qualify those units, or if they make 1 penny over, they don't qualify for those units. So it's like a band of an income level. And that has hampered the ability of many low-income people to apply for that so-called affordable housing.
Now, what does it take to turn that around legislatively in the city council? Is the deck so stacked against, you might say, lower middle income people in terms of affordable housing that the developers simply control the situation, as far as you see it? I mean, what does it take to turn it around?
It takes more than a simple majority of the council members. We're 51 members. We certainly have to have more than that, because if we pass any kind of legislation, the mayor could always veto it. We'd have to override that veto.
You think the mayor would? Do you see the mayor as a pro-big developer mayor?
Yes.
And what can you do about that?
We've tried to temper that with different measures to try to ensure more units of affordable housing, to try to ensure where there is development that we are engaging groups that are minority-owned, women-owned businesses, and to try to ensure that any result of jobs, that they will go to people in the community.
Let's talk a little bit just further about the developers. One of the things that tends to happen is that they are a big source of money for candidates. And as you well know, it costs money to run for office, at least to get your name even in front of the voters, let alone to get your message across. Many of the people in the council receive a lot of money from big developers. And now they say, well, that has no influence on my vote. That's what they say. Do you receive money from developers? Do you accept it?
I've received money from some not-for-profit developers who happen to be my friends.
So
but I don't, and I scan every check to find out if I don't know who the person is. I have someone do research. I've returned checks because they were developers in another district. When I first ran in 2005, was building something controversial in Brooklyn, and I just said thank you, but no thank you. Okay,
so is it fair to say that the big developers in this city do not have a hand in Rosie Mendez's pocket?
I think that's very fair to say.
Okay, well, also another matter, you, like all other council people, you have member items that you distribute to community groups and others, and yours is not a particularly long list compared to many others. It is perhaps 4,000 long, or it's $400,000? that you would distribute? About?
Because they parcel it out into funding that's dedicated for youth, funding that's dedicated for senior citizens, and then what we call our general discretionary funding.
Right. Now, I'm not going to go through the list, but I see a lot of community kinds of groups here. Are there any groups here where it's an organization that you or your friends or family are members of the board or control?
No.
Okay. So none of these are people that in any way are part of a Rosie Mendez political machine?
Correct. I mean, I do have many friends who are either on the board, because as a community activist, I worked with a lot of them on a lot of issues. And just because I'm in office, they're still worthy of funding. But if you go back and you look at my actual allocations, I really try to spread my money around. Instead of giving it all to one organization, I try to give them all a little bit, because my community is very needy and they need a lot of services, and my community is very diverse. So certainly what's needed in the Lower East Side is a little different than what's needed in Murray Hill, but I have to be responsive to all of my constituency.
Sure. And you can understand that the reason even I would ask you about this is because it is particularly highlighted in the Bronx, though it's not the only place where it happens, where the member items thing becomes nothing much more than used as a tool to build a political machine through control of community organizations, health centers, and so on and so forth.
But when you see a lot of money being funneled, that's a problem. So when this problem of slush funds hit the news a couple of years ago, someone was asking me, and they wanted to pass legislation in the city council to ban organizations that you had family members sitting on to receive funding. And I didn't think that was appropriate, because I knew of an example where Diana Reyna from Williamsburg, my old neighborhood, was funding Losures Housing Development Corporation. Her mother-in-law happened to live there. I grew up in that neighborhood, and shame on Diana Reyna if she didn't give Losures money. So why should a worthy organization like Losures be banned from getting money just because she has a family member who works there and has worked there, I think, prior to her getting into office? So I think there are things to look at, and when you see a lot of money, like all of your money. So if you take my 400,000, some council members, I'm not going to mention names, apparently was diverting the bulk of their money to a certain organization. It turns out they had family members on the board or working there. And then when we have initiatives that we work out as a group, they would make sure that same organization got a piece of that money as well. That's where, when you see a lot of money being diverted, that's where it raises questions, and you have to look a little deeper.